Okay. So Kuda actually sent me your work, and I was very much interested as well. Like, I really like the stuff you speak about around COVID and policing and how it becomes a security issue more than a health issue. So
Yeah.
before we get into that, I just wanted to find out from you, since we haven't met before outside of Kuda, just to tell me a bit about yourself, the work you do, and how you've been keeping busy and happy during the lockdown, which has been a difficult period for a lot of people.
Yeah, so my name is Kamau Wairuri. I am a PhD candidate at the University of Edinburgh in the Centre of African Studies. I'm working on a PhD, which is on issues of police accountability in Kenya. And so, I have used that lens in a way to look at how the government is responding to COVID-19 in Kenya. But my work mainly has been around issues of police, especially concerns of police brutality and issues of police accountability. So in a sense, this has been a very intense period because on the one hand, we are dealing with this global pandemic, which is affecting, everyone. Everyone somehow is, more or less getting affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. But at the same time, we have seen have very high levels of police brutality around the world. So initially, we saw, the very forceful enforcement of curfews and lockdowns. Especially the images from India and Pakistan were quite concerning. And then, it went on to Africa. We know that there has been problems of policing of the pandemic in European countries. But I think it was the killing of George Floyd that sort of captured everybody's imagination around this. And yet there had been a few other notable killings of Black men in the US as well, just before George's killing. So in a sense, the pandemic and the heightened attention towards police brutality cases has meant that for me, most of this time has been dealing with two major issues. On the one hand, looking at how myself and people around me and my communities are dealing with this question of the pandemic, but at the same time looking at police brutality at a global scale and then at the national scale, and how this is playing into the dynamics of the pandemic and so on. So it's been a heavy period in that sense, quite mentally draining and stressful. But I guess almost everybody has been having their fair share of troubles with it. So, I mean, as you ask about how I've been keeping happy, one of the ways I do this is taking very long walks in the nearby park. I guess Kuda might be connected to me on Instagram and Facebook, so you might have seen the pictures of me just wandering about. I'm going to feed the ducks. Yeah, but then also quite a lot of reading. I've read quite a lot. A bit more of fiction than I actually usually do a lot of the time, and also watched quite a lot of Netflix.
Yeah. Thanks a lot for that, Kamau. I mean, there's a lot of, I get the sense that there's a lot of personal and obviously academic reasons why the issue of policing is an issue. I just wonder, though, in the context of COVID-19, sort of what does that COVID-19 lens bring that sort of new? Is there anything happening new, for example, in Kenya or, for example, South Africa is our frame of reference, where some of these things are sort of replete and not necessarily something new. But in the Kenyan context, or at least even broadly, generally speaking, Are there certain connections that are perhaps already existing, or is there something different that COVID brings in the Kenyan context for policing and security, or is this a way that the government is now using to to stamp its authority a bit further, as it has maybe possibly always wanted to do? I'm not too familiar with the context, but I'm really curious to understand that aspect of the Kenyan environment.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, because one of the things that I guess initially when this pandemic was starting to gain root, there was all the argument about how this pandemic does not discriminate and how it's treating everybody equally. And I don't think it's in the piece I wrote for African Arguments, but I had written a previous piece about solidarity amongst the LGBTQ plus persons in Kenya during the period of the pandemic. And I do reference to Simukai Chigudu's book on the politics of an epidemic, where he examines the cholera epidemic in Zimbabwe. And the argument that what pandemics do is that they actually sort of freeze things in time and allow us to take a much closer look at how our societies actually operate, right? And so I think that we may not necessarily be seeing things that are very new or very different, but we are seeing the realities of how our societies are structured and how they operate being exposed a lot more by this pandemic. Because, well, for one thing, a lot of us, or a lot of people, are now paying attention to what's happening, so that even things that normally happen, people don't usually pay as much attention as they are doing now, because we are all sort of focused on very few things at the moment.
Yeah.
And this creates its own dynamic. So, for instance, I do think that the fact that George Floyd was killed during a pandemic actually matters quite a lot, because people were watching this in their homes, and it was much easier to mobilize people to then come up and protest against it. Because, I mean, he's not the first black man to be killed by the police in the US, but the way that this has created a movement around the world has quite a bit to do with the fact that that it is during the times of pandemic. So in Kenya as well, it's the same,
Yeah.
So police violence, police brutality is a very common feature of the Kenyan society, and it can be traced all the way back to the colonial times. Yeah, but for a lot of people, a lot of the, especially middle class people who hardly get affected by the brutality of the police, usually they don't pay much attention to it. And also, when they do, there's always the argument that the violence is targeted towards the wrong kind of people, like the bad people, the criminals. So they see it as a justified and a proper way of responding to crime and insecurity, right? But the pandemic has brought out, in reality, some of the things that are usually hidden. So, for instance, it's challenging those middle class and elite narratives about violence being targeted towards people who commit crimes or people who, quote unquote, deserve it. Because we've seen the police killing a child who's playing, on the balcony, right? We have seen in the most recent case, just about, I think, a week or two ago, where, policemen shot someone for not wearing a mask, and then protests erupted. And then, the police then shot another 2 people. So in the end, there were 3 dead people in this event in Nandi County, somewhere in Kenya's Rift Valley. So people now will hopefully, I don't know whether it's necessarily going to be the case, but hopefully people start to appreciate that when we talk about this police brutality, we are talking about such cases where the policemen are taking too much liberty with the power they have and the law and the system that is on their side to actually cause a lot of suffering and actually to kill people, you know? So in a sense, I hope that that it has brought the message closer home for people, especially those who support police violence, that if you support something like police brutality, you are essentially endorsing the killing of innocent people by police officers who, you know, just decide to act with impunity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that you actually mentioned George Floyd, and obviously it speaks to the Black Lives Matter movement. But I also just want to ask you, connecting with what you just said, that in the article you used they used this beautiful photo of well, it's a beautiful city actually, the streets of Nairobi, and the streets are empty. So speaking to what you've just said, I'm getting the point that sometimes pandemics actually come through and they expose things that probably have already existed as power dynamics in society. So speaking to that, does this empty street have any symbolic significance to your work, or kind of the way that spatial arrangements have changed because of spaces that used to be occupied are now empty? And also what I'm thinking now is how crazy it is that in lockdown, police had so much time and so much liberty to breach social distance and put their knees on top of George Floyd. So how does that speak to space and the way people have been governed in Kenya and across the world, Black people particularly?
Yeah, well, interesting question, especially about the photo, because actually I did not choose the photo. As a disclaimer, this I sent in the article, and the editorial team made the decision about the photo. But I wasn't opposed to it actually, because it does send some interesting messages about what the focus of the policing or governance in the times of pandemic has been, because you know there has been this, we've seen these photos all over the world about how empty the streets are, so that you know we now need to stay away from each other, create social distance in order to prevent the spread of the disease. But also it does send, as I've said, that pandemic sort of, you know, as Simukai argues, brings the realities much closer home. It does send another quite interesting message, and I was thinking about the work that someone like Johnny Steinberg has done on policing in South Africa, which you said is your reference country. And he argues that the whole idea of violent policing, especially targeted towards young men, is geared towards emptying the streets of young men, especially poor young men, because poor young men are almost always seen as a threat to security when they are on their own or when they are in groups. And so the idea is that, you know, police see their work as just getting these young men off the streets, because empty streets are therefore safe streets, you know. So I think in a sense it draws some parallels here, because I mean in the pandemic we are talking about the more open and empty this, you know, a space is, then the safer it is for people to citizens to occupy. And sometimes we don't necessarily ask the question of what or who are these people, or what, you know, who are these citizens for which we need to open up the space. And that's how the conversations of power sort of get hidden in the narratives and the conversations that we have. So, for instance, when we talk about space and creating social distance, I mean, we can see on an empty street in the center of Nairobi that can be a possibility, but then it has to be a very particular location within the city, right? Because further downtown, where a lot of the small enterprises are, you wouldn't find this kind of empty space. And to find such an empty space would mean that the police have intervened in that space in order to remove people from it, right? But then these people go into their homes in the informal settlements, where again the idea of space and social distancing is very difficult to enforce because they are congested. So as we say, you've got like 70% of Nairobi's population living in about, I think, 5% of the land in the city. So this starts to both expose and somehow conceal the narratives about how space is distributed amongst residents of a city. And the pandemic then serves to show that, some people have living rooms because people have been taking all these photos, living in the, enjoying the lockdown. Some people have living rooms that are the size of the houses of maybe 3 or 4 families, right? So then that sort of brings the issue of space into question. And the other thing is that one of the things that has been actually incredibly troubling is that the government has also evicted some residents of the informal settlements during the course of this pandemic. And at a time when the country was actually experiencing very heavy rains. So we had this, like 5,000 families suddenly finding themselves homeless in government-sanctioned evictions that were actually overseen by the police. Obviously, making it completely impossible for people to even practice, the social distancing measures, let alone even protect themselves. So that has been troubling. But I think the other thing that I also need to say here is that on the first day of the curfew, that process of emptying the streets of people at the end of the working day was, very strange, because in the effort for the police to actually get people off the streets, they ended up actually rounding up the people who had not gone home, which obviously was very counterproductive and, if you ask me, rather silly, because you're actually doing the very thing that you're trying to prevent. Yeah.
Well, Kamau, that's a very interesting perspective. I think one which we also see in South Africa, where when the state was also trying to help with sort of social grants and whatnot for people, it was, like you're saying, that sort of the concealment and also there's sort of a discursive construction of space where the state wants to make sure people are social distancing, but at the same time its mechanisms are also risking certain people. So here, old people who are waiting for their social grants would stand in very long queues. So the state is trying to help, but at the same time, it doesn't have the mechanisms to make sure that happened. But maybe the one thing that we always like to do here, I think if you saw from the title, we've sort of aptly called this initiative NerdNotReally, as a way to try to also tap into sort of the popular culture aspect of how we relate with our work. And we're going to give you an opportunity to, since you couldn't choose the photo that could be used in your piece, I'm going to give you a song, perhaps, or any sort of popular culture product that you could say describes or captures some of the political moment that we find ourselves in, or even the work that you do. And I'm not trying to sort of lead you into a trap. But I already know that Tupac is one of the people that you mentioned on your social media. I wonder if Tupac is gonna be that person.
No, so actually, the thing is, I'm quite nerdy or geeky in a sense. Like, I'm one of those guys who just keeps on like from the academic pathway and very like just focusing on analysis and such discourses. So every time I have a question about pop culture, it freaks me out because I usually can never get these things right. But there's one song that I have. It's an old song by Leonard Cohen. It's called "Everybody Knows." It's a weird and sort of melancholic tune, but I like the verses, which are like, everybody knows that the system is rigged, the war is over, we know that the good guys lost, and and that the dice is loaded, all this stuff. And I like that song. I've listened to it quite a bit in the course of this pandemic, because essentially it's speaking to the question of, or those lyrics. He goes on to talk about love a lot more in later part of the song. But in those lyrics, it brings out the questions of social injustice in the world. And I like that, because it's an easy way to pass the message across. That, we are saying it's a pandemic that's affecting everybody, but actually the dice is loaded. If you're Black, if you're already marginalized, then you're gonna pay a higher price. And not Tupac, but Black Eyed Peas as well, with the where is the love? Because I guess that's a conversation that needs to be had a lot. Like, we need to talk about not just tolerance, or not just us constantly fighting, but having some love. And I know someone talked about, I think they referred to Angela Davis's work on love as a political tool. I haven't read that work, but that's something that I actually need to go to see whether we can theorize and talk about love as a political tool for the world that we are going to live in post.
Wow, Kamau, that's like so interesting. Like, you just also reminded me of this song that I was listening to last weekend, Thomas Mafumo. It's called Pamuromo Chete, where he's talking about, it's almost like a statement, a letter to the government that you guys are so rude. How can you throw people out of their houses? How can you do A, B, C, D? And it speaks to that idea of love, to say, now we have both Black and white people equally threatened by the same pandemic, but we still have these systems that are still have been used to privilege other people. So, like you're saying, it's probably a moment to think more about love than hate, and I think that really resonates well with my identification with the Black Eyed Peas as well. So shout out to you for that one. Thanks, man. I think this is all we have for now. It's been I feel for me a fruitful 40 minutes. Like, I wish we could keep on going, man. Like, this is quite an interesting conversation, and thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure, and looking forward to see how the conversation goes.
All right, perfect,
guys.